38 years ago, a young girl in Lewisville vanished on her way home from work, leaving behind no trace except her locked Corolla sitting silently beside the lake. Authorities suspected she left voluntarily, but with no body, no witnesses, and virtually no leads to pursue, the investigation quickly stalled into a cold case. Yet, through all those years, investigators and the family never gave up hope, clinging to every tiny remaining detail, waiting for the day the truth would finally surface. Then one morning, when modern technology was applied to old photographs and forgotten evidence, a shocking detail, one that everyone had overlooked, suddenly emerged and turned the entire case upside down in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive into this breathless story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this content, don't forget to hit subscribe. A sweltering evening settled over Lewisville, Texas, carrying the lingering heat of a late 1980 summer as the old yellow lights behind the Lakeview fabric strip cast faint, patchy glows across the gravel lot. The air smelled of fabric, sizing, and hot asphalt from the parking lot next door, mixed with the breeze blowing in off Lewisville Lake, creating a feeling that was both familiar and strangely unsettling. Emily Grace Hargrove, a petite 19-year-old, appeared at the back door of the sewing shop, clutching a canvas bag and a folded lightweight jacket. She stepped slowly outside, her shoes tapping softly on the weathered concrete. A coworker happened to glimpse her from inside in the moment. Emily paused, tilting her head slightly, as if caught by a faint sound drifting from the darkness at the far end of the lot. It could have been the wind rustling through the trees, a distant car door closing, or an actual call, but Emily's face showed a flicker of confusion. Then, she kept walking without a word, and disappeared into the shadows of the nearly empty parking lot. The lot was almost deserted, only a handful of cars sitting motionless, like they were asleep. The bent trees in the evening breeze cast long, slicing shadows across the ground, making the whole space feel both languid and ominous. Far off, the surface of Lewisville Lake reflected a pale moon, its light blurred behind thin clouds. A passing car on the main road swept its headlights across the brick wall of the store, briefly illuminating Emily's brown hair before vanishing. That was the last image anyone in the area ever saw of her. That night dragged on slowly and heavily. In the Hargrove family home, the familiar dinner table was still set with Emily's place, her chair pushed in neatly as always. At first, her mother thought maybe Emily had stopped by a friend's house without calling, or stayed late to clean up at the shop. But minute after minute passed with no phone call, no footsteps at the door, no sign at all that Emily was on her way home. The family started calling her close friends, then the fabric store, then the neighbors. Everyone gave the same answer: no one had seen Emily since she left work. Worry spread like a long shadow, covering the entire house, tightening every corner. The initial assumptions and reassurances, "she's probably just running late," quickly melted away as time stretched on, and the silence grew too strange. Outside, the night wind carried moisture from the lake against the windows, making faint rattling sounds that startled Emily's mother every time. The atmosphere inside the house thickened, as if everything was waiting for something to happen: a knock, a phone call, any sign that she was okay. But nothing came. As the clock ticked into the deepest hours of the night, the family slowly realized this disappearance was no longer a delay or a minor mishap. It was something beyond anything they had ever imagined. And in that moment, amid the dead-still Texas night, beneath the eerily quiet neighborhood, the cold truth began to sink in with every breath: Emily had vanished without a trace. The next morning, as the first sunlight spread over the quiet streets of Lewisville, the Hargrove family, having barely slept, knew there was no longer any hope that Emily would walk through the door with her usual smile. They called the police the moment it was fully light. The Lewisville Police Department took the missing person report without hesitation, partly because Emily had never run away before, and partly because an overnight disappearance of a young woman was always treated as a red flag. The first two officers arrived at the house, took statements from the family, and immediately called for additional detectives from the Crimes Against Persons Unit. The atmosphere in the house grew tense but clearer, The family's raw worry was now replaced by the first concrete steps of an official investigation. The lead detective, a seasoned, middle-aged man, quickly asked the family to recount everything they knew. Emily left the store, never came home. No contact. It was all terrifyingly simple, far too few details to grab onto. So he decided to start with what could be verified immediately. Emily's usual route home. Normally, from Lakeview Fabrics, she only had to cross 2 intersections before turning into her neighborhood. It was the exact same route she took every day, never changing. Using that routine, the team quickly identified the 2 places to check first: the fabric store where she worked, and the area around Lewisville Lake, the only 2 spots she might have passed or been approached. 3 patrol cars left the station and split up. One team went to Lakeview Fabrics to interview staff, sweep the back lot, and look for anything unusual the family or co-workers might have missed. Another headed straight to the Lewisville Lake area, a place where people still fished or walked in the evenings, not crowded, but a spot where a young woman might have been noticed if she passed by. While the teams deployed, back at the station, the lead detective began building a temporary timeline of Emily's movements on the day she vanished. This was standard in every missing person case: who was the last to speak with her, who saw her leave the store, who might have had a reason to approach her that night. But only minutes into it, he stopped. The timeline had a gap, a bigger gap than he expected. According to co-workers, Emily walked out the back door after closing, but no one saw her get into her car. No one saw her car leave the area, and most crucially, no one on Lake Ridge Drive recalled seeing her familiar Corolla drive past that evening. The car had essentially vanished at the same moment Emily did. That gap made the detective note carefully. No one saw the vehicle move. No one heard an engine. No one saw Emily on the road home. An absolute silence surrounded the moment she left the store, and that was the most unusual thing of all. Voluntary disappearances usually leave tiny signs: a call, a note, some shift in behavior beforehand. Emily left nothing. When the Lakeview Fabrics team reported back that the rear lot was completely empty, no footprints, no dropped items, no signs of a struggle, the strangeness only grew. The lake team said the north parking area had a few cars left overnight, but they hadn't yet identified which might be Emily's. The lead detective started to feel this case smelled different. A 19-year-old girl couldn't simply step out a back door and dissolve into thin air, and the fact that no one saw her drive away made everything more confusing. He stood up, turned off his desk lamp, and stared at the map on the wall. From the fabric store to Emily's house was a short drive. No blind spots, no complicated intersections, no dangerous areas. So what had stopped her? When the teams returned to the station, the preliminary reports landed on his desk. No one saw Emily after she left the store. No one heard or saw anything unusual. No one spotted her Corolla on her normal route. That meant the timeline ended right there in the back parking lot, an abrupt full stop. In the detective's mind, one thought crystallized: this wasn't like ordinary missing person cases. Something didn't fit. Something had happened right after Emily stepped into the Lewisville night. And the biggest question, the one that opened the case's first real doubt: where did Emily go in that gap, and who was truly the last person to see her? That same morning, while the team was rechecking the area around Lakeview Fabrics, a sudden call from the patrol unit at Lewisville Lake Park instantly shifted the entire investigation. An officer radioed that they had located a silver Toyota Corolla, parked motionless in the north parking lot of the park, near the entrance to the trail leading down to the water's edge. The plates matched Emily's. The news made the lead detective freeze for several seconds. According to the family, Emily never went to Lewisville Lake at night, and it wasn't on her daily route. None of her friends had ever mentioned meeting her there. There was no event the previous evening that would have brought her to the park. The car turning up here, on the very night she disappeared, was inexplicable. The investigation team rushed to the scene. When they arrived, the parking lot was still nearly empty. Only a few scattered older cars. Wind gusts blew in off the lake, carrying the smell of damp grass and water. Emily's Corolla sat at the edge of the lot, isolated from the other vehicles, as if someone had deliberately parked it in a secluded corner to avoid attention. The detective stood in front of the car for a few seconds, silently observing, letting his instincts work. Something was wrong. On the outside, the car showed no signs of forced entry or damage. All 4 doors were locked, the windows were unscratched, the handles clean. No signs of a struggle nearby, no items strewn about, but it was that very too normal quality that put him on alert. A disappearance that leaves zero chaos. Either the victim left willingly, or the perpetrator was extremely careful. Lewisville Lake Park was a place people visited every evening to fish or enjoy the lake, but this particular area had dim lighting and limited sightlines, making it ideal for anyone wanting to avoid being seen. He placed a hand on the hood. The metal's temperature told him the car had been sitting far longer than a few hours, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly how long just by feel. The forensics team was called immediately. They began photographing, cordoning off a radius around the vehicle, and examining the ground for footprints, tire tracks, or any dropped evidence. But the surface here was a mix of gravel and grass, making tracks hard to capture. The detective surveyed the whole scene, then ordered the doors opened, using tools that preserved fingerprints. When the door swung open, the hot, trapped air rushed out, carrying the familiar smell of old upholstery. Everything inside was unnaturally neat. Seat belts coiled, passenger seat adjusted to its normal position. No signs anything had been rummaged through. Most importantly, nothing indicated Emily had ever sat in the car after leaving the fabric store. The jacket she carried out the back door wasn't there. The bag she had with her was missing. There was no evidence she had driven herself here. Everything was clean, silent, as if the car had been placed here rather than driven. The detective stepped back and looked at the overall picture again. The way the car was parked, its angle, its distance from the curb. Someone very familiar with their own car rarely parks that perfectly straight. It looked deliberate, isolated, calculated, and it wasn't the way Emily usually parked. He jotted in his notebook, vehicle parked too neatly, likely not operated by victim. A young officer ran up with more information. A fisherman from the previous night recalled seeing the Corolla in the lot fairly early in the evening, but he couldn't be sure who was driving because of the poor light. He only saw a figure get out and walk quickly toward the lake trail. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. He didn't know if it was Emily or someone else. Just one figure, alone. With years of experience, the detective knew disappearances often hinge on the smallest details: the car's position, parking style, the victim's driving habits. And here, everything was off its normal track. Emily had no reason to come to the lake at night. Emily didn't park like this. No one saw Emily driving away. The car appeared in a place she never intended to go, in a manner completely unfamiliar to her. This was no longer a case of a girl who got lost. This was something else. As the officers finished cordoning off the lot to expand the search, the detective took one last look toward the sun-glinting water. There was a feeling here, a haze between what they could see and what had actually happened. And it all started with this Corolla, the car that showed up in a place Emily would never have chosen on the night she vanished. When the Corolla's door was opened with specialized tools to preserve evidence, the hot, humid air trapped inside rushed out, carrying the distinctive smell of plastic and aged fabric upholstery. The detective leaned in to scan the driver's area, his eyes quickly sweeping the usual spots for anything unusual. Within seconds he spotted the first thing: the driver's seat was pushed far back, much farther than Emily ever set it. The family had already confirmed she was short, and always moved the seat close to the wheel. This wasn't a position she could drive comfortably in, and it wasn't the posture of someone familiar with the car. He noted immediately: seat adjusted unusually, strong possibility someone else was driving. But what grabbed the whole team's attention was something in the center console area between the front seats. A small object, so ordinary at first glance it could easily be overlooked, lay lightly touching the edge of the parking brake lever. A thin, old, slightly discolored piece of metal. One look was enough to know it didn't belong to Emily. The family later confirmed she never carried any unusual metal items, and didn't use accessories made of that material. The detective lifted it with tweezers, and turned it slowly in the rising sunlight. The small metal piece had grooves along the edges, a style of craftsmanship not sold in any local stores. Not Emily's, he stated, but said no more. Detectives are always cautious before jumping to conclusions. The very existence of this tiny object, however small, drew his focus to what it implied: someone else had been inside the car before it was left in the Lewisville Lake parking lot. He continued checking the rest of the interior, but everything was too tidy, almost too clean. The glove box hadn't been opened, the cup holders had no drink rings, the floor mats showed no strange shoe prints, the dashboard had no smudged fingerprints, yet that very absence of anything created unease. If this had been a sudden attack, the car should show some disarray. If Emily had fled in panic, there should at least be signs of haste. But everything was calm to the point of looking staged, or deliberately reset. That made the case feel more sophisticated. The detective opened the trunk, nothing unusual there, either. Spare tire, basic toolkit, a few random items, nothing disturbed, no strange mud, no drag marks or signs something had been stuffed in and removed. The entire car seemed scrubbed of abnormalities, except for that one tiny piece of metal. He returned to the driver's seat and examined it again. When he sat in the current position, someone Emily's height couldn't reach the brake or gas pedals, meaning the car had been driven by a completely different person, taller, with longer legs. This wasn't an accidental adjustment. Someone drove this car, and drove it to the exact parking spot where they intended to abandon it. The detective scanned the lot once more. The Corolla's position showed the driver didn't want attention, not near streetlights, not near the exit, not near the park entrance cameras. It was a safe spot for someone who didn't want to be identified. The forensics team came back to dust the door handles, mirrors and dashboard for usable prints. One officer reported finding a few smudges, but nothing clearly valuable yet. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no clear evidence Emily had ever sat in the driver's seat after leaving the fabric store. It was as if she never got into the car after coworkers last saw her in the back lot. The detective knew that in missing person cases, the smallest details often lead to answers. That tiny metal object, the only thing that didn't belong to Emily, became the starting point for a much larger theory. Seat pushed too far back, car parked meticulously, no disturbance inside, appearing in a place Emily had no reason to visit. Put together, it painted a blurry but suspicious picture. Someone else drove this car, and that person might be the first link between where Emily disappeared and where the Corolla was found. The first real suspicions now had shape, and the case was no longer simply a missing person. This was something more sophisticated, quieter, and far more dangerous. The fact that the Corolla was found in a place Emily had no reason to visit forced the Lewisville PD team to widen their canvas of witness statements, focusing on anyone who had been around the lake the night Emily vanished. The parking lot sat next to a trail leading down to shallow water, a spot where people fished or walked both day and night, so the odds were high someone had seen something. But as officers began interviewing potential witnesses, they quickly realized a bigger problem. The statements seemed related yet didn't line up, almost tearing Emily's timeline into contradictory, overlapping layers. The first witness was a middle-aged woman who walked the park every evening for exercise. She described seeing a young woman dressed like the description of Emily walking onto the trail that led down toward the lake that night. She couldn't see the face clearly because of the dim light, and since nothing seemed unusual at the time, she hadn't paid close attention, but she was certain the girl was walking alone and seemed a bit hurried. This was the first statement suggesting Emily might have left the car at the park and walked down toward the water by herself. However, when the investigation team re-examined old traffic camera footage near the park and interviewed more local residents, they obtained a second witness statement, one that went in a completely opposite direction. A man living near the park entrance said he had seen the Corolla parked in the lot quite early that evening, and what caught his attention was a man leaning against the hood as if waiting for someone. He described the man as wearing a baseball cap and a dark jacket, with no one resembling Emily nearby. He also said the man stood there for quite a while, before disappearing toward the trail or the sparse woods. Most importantly, he did not see any woman get out of or into the car during the entire time he was watching. If true, this would completely contradict the first witness's statement. Some officers temporarily assumed the first witness might have been mistaken or misidentified someone, but when the lead detective began digging deeper into both accounts, he realized the two statements carried roughly equal credibility. Both people were regulars in the area and had legitimate reasons to be there at that time. Yet both scenarios could not have happened simultaneously. Either Emily entered the park alone, or a man had been standing beside the Corolla after it was parked. Just as the team was struggling to reconcile the two conflicting statements, a third witness emerged and made the case even more elusive. A long-haul truck driver, who regularly used the route through Carrollton toward Highway 121, said he had seen a Corolla the same color as Emily's speeding toward Carrollton that evening. He didn't get a clear look at the driver, but the car was moving unusually fast and hurried, which made him remember it. When pressed for more details, he insisted the car was coming from the direction near Lakeview Fabrics, not from the lake. The lead detective immediately recognized how complicated these three statements were. If the Corolla was heading toward Carrollton, it couldn't have been parked at the Lewisville lake lot at the same time the first witness saw the young woman. But if the Corolla appeared early at the lake as the second witness claimed, it couldn't have been on the Carrollton road that same evening. The three accounts created three separate timelines. To test the logic, the team went back to the geography. Lakeview Fabrics to Carrollton was about a 12-15-minute drive. Carrollton back to Lewisville Lake added another 10-12 minutes. That meant the car, if it really went through Carrollton, could easily have had enough time to reappear at the lake before the first witness saw someone resembling Emily walking into the park. Still, the detective refused to rely on assumptions. He needed clearer data. The biggest question now wasn't who was driving, but where did the car appear first? During deeper interviews, the third witness, the truck driver, remembered one more detail. The Corolla he saw had slightly delayed brake lights, typical of an older car, which matched Emily's Corolla perfectly. But he wasn't certain of the exact time, only that it was around dusk. That uncertainty made the statement both potentially accurate and potentially misleading. Meanwhile, the first and second witnesses were both confident about the time they were in the park area. They didn't know each other, yet their descriptions of the timing were fairly consistent. That tilted the detective toward the possibility that the car had been brought to the parking lot earlier, possibly right after leaving Carrollton, and the truck driver had seen it while it was en route. This would resolve all the contradictions. The car appeared in Carrollton first, was then driven to the park. The man was seen next to the Corolla, and finally the first witness saw a young woman walking into the park. But that opened a deeper problem. If Emily wasn't driving her own car, who was moving it around multiple locations before leaving it at the lake? The detective stood beside the sealed Corolla as it was prepared for transport back to the station, and he could feel the case cracking into multiple branches. Every witness statement had its own value, but when pieced together, they pushed the story in a direction no one wanted to consider. Emily may never have gotten into her car after leaving Lakeview Fabrics. The Corolla may have become someone else's vehicle that night. And as the timeline began to tear into layers, the case shifted from a mysterious disappearance to something far more complex, a type where every tiny detail could be true, or just a false trail forcing the team far off the real path. With the conflicting statements splintering the timeline into multiple branches, the investigation team returned to the scene at Lewisville Lake Park determined to find what they had missed during the initial search. It was a new morning, cooler, with the ground still damp from the night before, better conditions for preserving traces than the evening Emily vanished. The search was expanded, 6 more officers, 2 additional forensic technicians, and a K-9 unit. Everyone fanned out from the spot where the Corolla was found, heading toward the shoreline and the trails leading into the low brush. About 15 minutes after widening the search radius, a young officer called out loudly, drawing the lead detective over, in a soft patch of earth, about 30 meters from the parking lot. Near the trail down to the water's edge, they discovered 2 clear sets of footprints in the sandy soil, one small and light, the other noticeably larger and deeper. The detective crouched down, examining every detail. The smaller print was short, matching the shoe size of someone Emily's build. The larger print was significantly wider, with a longer stride and heavier impression, signs of an adult male with considerably more body weight. But what caught his attention wasn't the size, it was the direction of movement. The two sets of prints did not run parallel, like two people walking side by side. They overlapped for a short stretch. Then at the end, both sets stopped abruptly, right in front of a small depression in the ground, where the grass was pressed flat and bent sharply to one side, as if something heavy had rested there. There were no returning footprints, no drag marks. Both sets simply ended at that spot. The detective narrowed his eyes. No continuing steps. No steps going back. What does that mean? Another officer stepped closer and knelt beside the flattened grass. Looks like the mark from a car door being opened, sedan type, or maybe a little lighter. The detective got down on one knee to examine the depth of the depression and the way the grass was crushed. Marks like these often appeared when a car door was opened for someone to get in or be placed inside. Even if it was only an initial theory, it fit too well to ignore. The canine was brought over to track any human scent, but the lake breeze had washed most of it away, and after so much time, picking up a trail was nearly impossible. Still, the dog paused exactly at the edge, where the footprints ended, circled once, then sat, indicating a concentration of scent there, though not enough to follow further. The detective signaled the team to back off so they wouldn't destroy the evidence. He studied the path of the prints. The shorter section showed no long strides, meaning the smaller person, possibly Emily, wasn't running, just walking normally, or being led. The larger person's strides were even and deep, showing no hurry, no slipping, as if that individual was completely in control of the situation. If these were Emily's prints, and those of the person with her, the question was no longer where did she go, but who was taking her, and how. He turned to the trail and carefully examined both directions. If Emily had walked down to the park on her own, as the female witness claimed, her footprints should have continued farther, toward the water or deeper along the trail. But the smaller prints appeared from the grassy edge, leading from the parking lot, not from the main trail. This reinforced the theory. Emily did not walk down the main trail into the park by herself. She arrived from a different direction, possibly from her car or a spot where the man led her. An officer suggested checking for tire tracks nearby, and within minutes, they located a faint but distinct set different from any Corolla pattern. Though blurred by wind and foot traffic, the direction of these tire marks ran parallel to the spot where the footprints ended. Though not yet confirmed, the detective saw the clear possibility at least two vehicles were involved. Emily's Corolla and another car. Two sets of footprints stopping abruptly at a point consistent with an open car door. The smaller person, possibly Emily, stepping in or being placed inside. The larger person nearby, possibly the driver of the second vehicle. That fit the neighbor's statement about a man standing beside the Corolla, and it also fit the truck driver seeing the Corolla heading toward Carrollton. If someone else was driving Emily's car, the second vehicle could have been the one that took the victim away. The detective slowly stood up, eyes still fixed on the spot where the footprints vanished. This wasn't a walk. This was an exit point. His voice was low and firm. The officers around him understood that the missing person case had now tipped heavily toward taken elsewhere, no longer Emily leaving the area on her own. As they marked each critical location with forensic stakes, the detective felt the shift in the case's atmosphere. No longer a simple missing girl. No longer a wrong turn or voluntary runaway. Two sets of footprints, two different sizes, ending together and never appearing again. That was the first evidence Emily did not leave the park on foot. She was taken, and whoever took her knew exactly what they were doing. After confirming the two strange sets of footprints near the lake shore, and shifting the investigation firmly toward the likelihood that Emily had been taken by someone else, Lewisville PD immediately moved to the next phase, narrowing down everyone who had direct contact with Emily in the 48 hours before she vanished. This is a basic but critical tactic in any serious missing person case, mapping the victim's final circle, identifying who had opportunity, motive, and an unaccounted for window of time matching Emily's disappearance. In the small briefing room at the station, the lead detective pinned up a list of 7 names compiled from family, co-workers, friends, and people known to be around Lakeview Fabrics. 1. Nathan Price, co-worker on the last shift with Emily. The last person known to speak with Emily before she left the store. He said she seemed a little tired, but showed no unusual signs. Nathan stayed behind to do inventory, confirmed by others. Police quickly verified his timeline and found a solid alibi. When Emily was believed to be at the lake parking lot, Nathan was still working with the manager. He was cleared within the first 20 minutes. 2. Kelly Morris, Emily's best friend, met the previous afternoon. Talked a lot with Emily, but knew of no special plans. However, Kelly had a roughly 90-minute gap that evening when she left to pick up medicine for her mother, but couldn't recall exact times. The gap wasn't incriminating, but it couldn't be ignored. She became the second name marked for follow-up. 3. Brian Ellis, regular customer at Lakeview Fabrics, who had shown interest in Emily, had asked Emily out several times and been turned down. Brian claimed he was home watching a baseball game with a friend that night, but the friend misremembered when the game started, making the alibi imperfect. No hard evidence he was lying, but the inconsistency kept him on the potential suspect list. 4. Steve Hargan, worker in the same strip mall, store a few doors down from Lakeview Fabrics. Multiple employees had seen Steve near the back parking lot around the time Emily left. When questioned, Steve said he was just taking out trash and didn't see Emily. No one could confirm that, and the area's old camera had been broken for weeks. No clear motive, but definite opportunity. 5. Richard Collins, local resident near Lewisville Lake Park that night. The man who reported seeing a man standing beside the Corolla. When pressed further, Richard said he couldn't remember the man's face clearly. Police noted he seemed tense talking about that evening. Physically and age-wise, though, he didn't match the larger footprint. Richard stayed on the list but lower priority. 6. Mark DeLuca, the truck driver who saw the Corolla heading toward Carrollton, provided crucial testimony but was uncertain about timing. Work records showed a 45-minute unaccounted window when he could have been anywhere, a window that overlapped with when Emily might have been moved. Not a top suspect yet, but under watch. 7. David Renteria, delivery worker, who had a minor argument with Emily 3 days earlier over a late shipment, claimed he went straight home after work and never left the house that night. No one could confirm it. What caught the detective's attention? David owned a small car that could match the faint tire track near the lake. As the detective stood in front of the board, he circled each name again. Nathan was fully cleared. 6 remained. The problem, none of the 6 perfectly matched the evidence at the scene. Kelly had a time gap, but no motive to harm Emily. Brian had mild motive, but no proof he was near the park. Steve had opportunity, but no suspicious behavior. Richard was at the park, but didn't fit the large footprint. Mark gave important testimony, but lacked precision. David could drive the second car but had unclear motive. All had gray areas, yet none stood out clearly as suspect number 1. The detective looked back at the map, 1 large footprint, 1 small, a car in the wrong place, statements shredding the timeline, and 6 men and women, each carrying their own piece of mystery. "We're missing a piece," he said. "Someone who might not even be on this list, or a detail we haven't seen yet that's hiding the truth." His face stayed expressionless, but his voice grew heavier. When every suspect feels off, it usually means the real person involved is hiding inside the smallest details, or inside someone no one has thought of yet. And that was when the case entered its hardest phase. No one fit perfectly, but anyone could be the missing piece of Emily's puzzle. While the team kept digging into the remaining 6 names with their strange gray areas, the forensic unit returned to the Corolla for a second, far more meticulous examination, this time focusing on places the first sweep might have missed. Having worked many missing person cases, the lead detective knew the car was often the richest source of evidence. It was the one object the victim was guaranteed to have been connected to in her final known moments. And if someone else had driven the Corolla, their traces usually showed up in the tiniest, least obvious spots. A young technician, while scanning the floor and seat rails with a UV light, suddenly stopped. He leaned in deeper, aimed the light, and called the lead detective over. Wedged in the narrow gap between the driver's seat rail and the carpet was something that glowed faint blue under the UV. A metal object, small, about 2 finger lengths long, pressed so tightly against the seat edge that it couldn't fall out unless someone deliberately looked for it. The detective crouched, used specialized tweezers to extract it, and brought it into natural light. It was clearly an old metal key, dull gray with worn grooves along the edges. It didn't resemble any common house key in the area, nor a car key, cabinet key, or typical personal key. "Any numbers?" the detective asked. The technician turned the key and examined it under a magnifying glass. "No serial number, no markings, just a very faint engraving, looks like the letter C, followed by 2 digits, 5 and 8. He paused. "C58. Etched so lightly it almost looks deliberately worn down." The detective was silent for several seconds. A strange key under the driver's seat, exactly where the person operating the car would have been sitting. And most crucially, Emily never used a key like this. It didn't belong to her house, the fabric store, her friends, or any property the family had ever mentioned. "Did we already ask the family?" the detective said, though he already knew the answer. "We did," the technician replied. "They're 100% certain Emily never had any key like this. Nobody in the family had ever seen one." "What about her workplace?" "Already checked. No connection." The detective turned the key in his hand, feeling the worn metal surface. Keys that had been ground down like this were rarely done to hide normal use. They were altered to erase identifying marks and prevent tracing back to the original lock or system. A clue like this almost never showed up in simple disappearances. It usually only appeared in cases that were staged, or tied to a location the perpetrator didn't want anyone to know about. "Any chance the key fell out of Emily's pocket?" an officer asked, even though he knew it wouldn't change anything. The detective shook his head. Emily didn't carry a key like this, and if it had fallen from a pocket, it would be on the carpet, not wedged in this gap. The narrow crevice under the seat could only trap a key if the person sitting in the driver's seat accidentally dropped it while getting in or out, or if the seat was adjusted and the motion pushed it deep into a spot invisible to the naked eye. A slow realization formed. The person who drove the car to the lake the night Emily vanished had dropped this key, not Emily. Someone else. The detective signaled the technician to seal the key in an evidence bag. This was the first piece of physical evidence with real potential to open an entirely new investigative path, an object that belonged to neither the victim nor anyone on the initial suspect list, and possibly not even to any place Emily had ever been. "C58, he whispered. "Any lock with this code will bring us closer to whoever drove her car." An officer asked, "Could it be a warehouse key, or an old facility key?" The detective didn't answer right away. He turned back to look at the Corolla one more time, the car like a silent box holding the truth. Seat pushed far back, large footprints leading her to the water's edge. The car parked in a place Emily never went, and now this strange metal key with a nearly erased engraving. It was no random object. It was the first clue that belonged to someone else, the person who sat in that car, who knew how to park discreetly, who led Emily down to the lake, or took her away, and who accidentally left the one trace he hadn't planned to hide. The detective gave the key one last look before it was sealed. "We just found our first real lid," he said quietly, "and the owner of this key is probably the last person who was with Emily the night she disappeared." The strange metal key marked to C58 instantly became the focal point of the case. The detective knew full well in a disappearance where almost every trace had vanished, an object that didn't belong to the victim and didn't match anyone on the suspect list was a rare gift. The only problem left was decoding it. Since Lewisville PD had no in-house lock expert, the C58 key was overnighted to a seasoned locksmith in Dallas, Howard Clay, who had worked with police many times on cases involving storage units, old industrial sites, and abandoned warehouses. With over 30 years of experience with discontinued lock lines, Howard could often tell a key's era just by holding it. When he received the evidence, Howard spent nearly an hour turning the key under bright light and examining it with a high magnification loupe. He checked every edge, every groove, compared it to standard key blanks from different decades. Then he called the lead detective back with a confident voice. "This isn't a new key, it's from an old lock generation, late 1970s to mid-1980s. The kind used for private storage lockers, industrial cabinets, or mini-storage rental units." The detective asked, "Is this type still common?" Howard gave a short laugh. "No, production stopped long ago. Anywhere still using them today has to be an old unupgraded facility or a building that hasn't changed locks in decades." That information made the detective sit up straight. A key, from an old storage lock system, found under the driver's seat of Emily's Corolla, and deliberately ground down to erase identifying marks. That level of intent could not be ignored. "What about C58? He asked. Howard answered, "That's a batch code for the lock cylinder, not the individual key. It's most common on old mini-storage locks." The detective pressed further. "Any places around Lewisville still using this type?" Howard thought for a moment, then said clearly, "Not many. But if you expand to Carrollton, there's one that fits perfectly. Carrollton Storage, the north section, built in the late 70s. I remember they ordered a whole batch of C-Series locks back then." Carrollton Storage. Those two words made the detective jot them down immediately in his report. It was the first name in the entire case directly tied to a concrete piece of evidence, not a vague statement, not speculation, not an assumption. A real location, a specific place, one that could hold traces of the person who drove Emily's Corolla, and more importantly, Carrollton Storage sat right along the route the truck driver witness had said he saw the Corolla speeding that night. A piece that suddenly fit a statement the team had almost given up on verifying now had a serious reason to be re-examined. The detective called the Carrollton Storage manager immediately to ask about lock replacement history. The manager confirmed, "The old section rows key and D still has the original 1970s locks. Some units haven't been changed since we opened." When asked about rental records from the 1980s, the manager replied instantly, "Paper files from back then aren't complete. A lot were damaged in the 1993 flood. What's left is disorganized and unsorted." That created both an opening and another layer of difficulty. If the records were destroyed, identifying who rented a unit the year Emily vanished would be nearly impossible. The detective didn't miss a beat. He asked one more thing. "Has anyone accessed the old section recently?" The manager answered, "A few people have come to clean out or close long-term units, but row C gets almost no traffic. Many units have been abandoned or unpaid for decades." That answer sharpened the detective's focus. Low-traffic places were exactly where perpetrators like to hide evidence. He reviewed the case data again. Key found under driver's seat. The person driving Emily's car likely owned or used this key. Key belongs to an old storage system. Carrollton Storage is the only facility within 15 miles, still using C-Series lock. Witness saw Corolla heading toward Carrollton the night Emily disappeared. Suddenly, the pieces locked together far more logically than before. The detective asked Howard one final question. "If this key opens a unit at Carrollton Storage, is it possible it was rekeyed or swapped?" Howard replied, "Possible, but unlikely. These are hard to rekey, and the main grooves are still intact. I can see that. So the odds are very high it still opens at least one C-row lock." He added something that made the detective go quiet for several seconds. "The grinding on the edges shows the user wanted to erase the batch markings, so the lock's origin couldn't be traced. That's common with people trying to hide the existence of a storage unit. Calculated, intentional, not accidental." When the call ended, the detective stared at the key sealed in its evidence bag. Small, rough, old, but worth more than any previous piece of evidence. If this key's trail led to Carrollton Storage, then Emily, or clues about whoever took her, may have been there. The C58 key was no longer just a strange object under a car seat. It had become the first symbol of a completely new investigative direction, pulling the case away from Lewisville Lake and pointing it straight to Carrollton, where the first real answer might be waiting behind an old metal door that had stayed silent for nearly 4 decades. News from Carrollton Storage brought the first ray of hope after days of the case spinning in circles through contradictory statements, but that hope was quickly coated in the dust of the past when the detective saw reality. Every rental record from 1986, the year Emily vanished, was gone. The Carrollton storage manager explained, "We kept the old paper files in a small room next to the office, but in 1993, a major flood hit the area and destroyed everything that hadn't been digitized yet." The detective looked around, feeling a chill run down his spine, not from the wind, but because he knew that when a case hinges on traces from the past, and the past has been erased by something no one could control, it's a sign the file is heading toward a dead end. Row C back then had dozens of renters, mechanics, families in temporary moves, small business owners, people storing old belongings. Now there was no record of who they were, when they came and went, or even which units they used. The files that could have linked the C58 key to a specific lock, or a specific renter, had been swallowed by time and flood water. The detective stood in the middle of the silent row of units, hundreds of old metal doors lined up like corridors into darkness. He pictured Emily, or whoever was involved, walking here while the sun was still up or after night had fallen. But now it was all just guesswork. He asked the legal team to search utility records, payment receipts, credit contracts, anything that might still exist from that era. But the manager shook his head. "We only have electronic records from 1998 onward. Everything before that was paper, meaning no traces, no renter lists, no proof of who had a key, who closed a unit, who cleared one out in 1986. A case whose main clue pointed to a place where all data had been wiped, almost deliberately, even if only by natural disaster, was the kind that made the detective feel pushed 10 steps backward. Back at Lewisville PD headquarters, he placed the C58 key in the center of the large briefing table. 6 officers stood around it, staring at the tiny object that weighed more than any evidence before it. "No records, no renter lists," he said. "This key is now floating in a void." One officer asked, "So what do we do next? Without the lock or the renter, a key alone doesn't get us anywhere." The detective looked at the key, and answered in the tense silence, "It gets us one thing. It tells us this was not a voluntary disappearance. This belongs to someone else, the person who drove Emily's car." Those words made the room freeze for a few seconds. In the summary report, sent to superiors, a week later, the detective had to write lines he never wanted to see in a missing person file. No identified suspect, no body recovered, no remaining data at Carrollton storage, no new witnesses, no additional traces on the vehicle. It became the heaviest case file Lewisville PD had that year. Every clue seemed to point to Carrollton, but Carrollton had nothing left to grab onto. None of the names on the suspect list connected to the old storage facility. None had worked nearby. None had reason to be in Carrollton the month Emily vanished. The case felt like a journey cut short the moment hope appeared. Time passed. New cases kept piling up. The people of Lewisville slowly forgot the name Emily Hargrove, except for her family, and a few close friends who still carried the pain every time they drove past the fabric store where she once worked. Gradually, her file was moved to the cold case cabinet, literally, where stalled investigations were preserved in the hope that one day technology, or a new statement, might bring light again. And for nearly 2 decades, the metal key marked C58 became a symbol of helplessness, the only clue that belonged to someone else, yet unable to open any door. It lay silent in its evidence bag under frosted glass, reminding everyone that Emily's case wasn't short on questions, it was just short on a path forward. The disappearance became a true cold case, dormant, heavy, and no one knew that years later, that very same little key would drag everything back to the surface, in a way no one in 1986 could have imagined. Nearly 20 years after Emily's file was frozen, in 2024, a wave of new technology opened a door the 1986 investigators could never have dreamed of, reconstructing crime scenes from old film photos, using LiDAR and artificial intelligence. While Lewisville PD was reviewing long-dormant missing person cases for the state's Cold Case Improvement Program, Emily Hargrove's file was flagged as high priority because of one unsolved piece of evidence, the C58 key. No body, no storage records, no witnesses made the case far harder than most cold cases, but the existence of that ownerless key made the new experts see it as a perfect candidate for cutting-edge scene reconstruction testing. A forensic image analysis team from the Texas State Crime Lab was brought in. They gathered every original 1986 crime scene film photo, shots taken with a Nikon F3, low resolution, colors faded to silver, some cracked at the corners, blurred, washed out by the harsh flash of the era. Those photos, once used only to document the Corolla's position at Lewisville Lake, now became critical material when fed into a digitization and environmental simulation pipeline using the latest technology. First, the team scanned the photos with specialized LiDAR equipment, not to measure depth in the 2D images which have none, but to generate point clouds that recreated terrain structure based on light falloff and object shapes. Combined with AI edge analysis, they were able to rebuild the car's exact parking angle, the slope of the lot, shadow lengths, light direction, and most crucially, the dirt clinging underneath the chassis, something the 1986 photographer had accidentally captured without realizing it would one day become the most important detail in the entire case. When the first 3D model appeared on screen, the 2024 cold case detective immediately noticed something odd. The soil stuck under the car was noticeably darker than the dirt at Lewisville Lake. At first they thought it was color degradation in the old film, but after AI-based color correction, the difference remained. Lewisville Lake soil is fine sand mixed with light clay. The dirt under the Corolla was far too dark and coarse, more like industrial soil, old storage lot ground, or cracked concrete areas, not lakeside earth. The technician zoomed in on the undercarriage. The LiDAR data still held enough particle structure for the AI to run a geological match against North Texas soil libraries. After the comparison finished, the result left the entire team silent. 76% probability, the soil under the car matched the old ground in Carrollton. Less than 5% probability, it matched Lewisville Lake soil. The 2024 lead detective stared at the results, heart pounding as if the whole case was reopening right in front of him. If the soil under the car didn't match Lewisville Lake, it meant one very clear thing no one in 1986 had considered: the Corolla was not driven straight from the fabric store to the park. It had been in Carrollton first. An AI specialist ran the reconstruction model a second time, this time analyzing the vehicle's direction of travel based on the dirt patterns around the tires. The results made everything even clearer. Coarse-grained soil clung more heavily to the front tire edges than the rear, a classic sign of a car moving from cracked concrete onto old asphalt or tar. Lewisville Lake has no such soil. Carrollton storage and the ground behind it do. The detective stood up from his chair. If the car came from Carrollton, then the driver couldn't have been Emily, he said, eyes locked on the model. She had no reason to swing through Carrollton and then come back to the lake. The analysis team began rebuilding the entire sequence of the car's movements. Carrollton Drive to Lewisville Lake Park, overly neatly exit the vehicle. This matched perfectly with something the 1986 file had never resolved. The driver's seat pushed way too far back for Emily's height. If a man drove from Carrollton to the lake, adjusting the seat made total sense. A technician ran a simulation of the steering angle, based on the faint tire marks still visible in the old photos. The AI determined the Corolla's parking angle at the lake matched the habits of someone used to small 1980s cars, but not Emily's usual slight leftward lean when she parked. Everything, the seat, the dirt, the parking position, told the same story: someone else drove the car, not Emily. To double-check the model, the team brought actual soil samples from Carrollton Storage and Lewisville Lake back to the lab for physical comparison with the AI model. The physical results backed the digital ones. 100% Carrollton soil contained old cement dust and fine gravel. Lewisville Lake soil was light clay and fine sand. The dirt under the Corolla contained cement dust that matched Carrollton perfectly. The detective stepped back, realizing that for 20 years they had started from the wrong point. They had searched the lake, the parking lot, witnesses in the park, but if the car hadn't been driven straight there, everything at the lake was just the end of a route, not the beginning of the crime. "We started in the wrong place," he said. "The real scene isn't the lake, it's Carrollton." That was the first major twist in 20 years. The Corolla didn't arrive at Lewisville Lake on its own. It had been moved. The person driving it, not Emily, had deliberately brought it there to create a stage scene. The Emily Hargrove case was no longer just a disappearance. It had become a carefully staged crime scene. And the C-58 key was no longer just a mystery object. It was the clue pointing to the real location where everything began. Once the AI model and soil analysis confirmed the Corolla had been in Carrollton before appearing at Lewisville Lake, Lewisville PD immediately requested a search warrant for Carrollton storage. The Denton County judge approved it the same day, given the special nature of the cold case and the scientific findings accepted as valid probable cause. A small task force, along with forensic technicians, arrived at Carrollton storage the next morning. The old storage area carried the gloomy color of time, rusted metal doors, cracked concrete floors, thick dust swirling in the air, and rows of sparrows nesting under the eaves. Row C, the section suspected of being tied to the C-58 key, sat deep at the back, virtually unused for the past 30 years. As the team walked the corridor of Row C, they noticed many units were empty. Some locks were new, others still had the original 1970s, 80s cylinders. The lead detective signaled a technician carrying a duplicate C-58 key that the lab had cut for testing. The key was tried in 12 different C-series locks along the row, none opened. No one was surprised, very few of those old locks were still functional after decades. But that didn't weaken the case, it just meant they had to look for something else. False walls, repaired units, or rooms that had been structurally altered. A Carrollton storage maintenance worker, who had been there over 25 years, walked with the team and pointed toward the end of the row. Unit C-58 was repaired after 1993, flood damage. The old owner fixed it himself, not to original specs. The word C-58 made the detectives' nerves snap tight. Not a coincidence, couldn't be. They approached Unit C-58, an old door with green moss growing along the bottom edge. The lock had been replaced with a newer one, but the door frame still matched the others. The moment the door opened, a wave of musty air hit them, dust rising in thin streaks under flashlight beams. Inside was nothing but abandoned junk, broken cardboard boxes, an old table, empty picture frames. But one technician spotted something odd. The back right wall was painted a shade that didn't match the rest, brighter, smoother, no water stains, far too new for the unit's age. This was patched, he said, tapping lightly. The sound was hollow. The detective ordered, "Stop. Don't touch anything else. Get the techs in." A fiberscope camera was threaded through a small gap in the wall. The feed showed an unnatural void behind the drywall, not part of the original unit design. It wasn't large, just roughly 1 meter wide by 1.5 meters tall, exactly the size to hide something or someone. When the FBI was called in for controlled demolition, they used specialized cutting tools to peel back the drywall. The sheet came away like wet paper. Behind it was the void the camera had revealed. In that space, beneath decades of dust, sat a dark brown wooden box, so old the wood grain had darkened with age, but remained intact. The lid had no lock, only old twisted wire binding it shut, as if whoever hid it didn't want nails, just something that could still be opened easily. A technician in latex gloves carefully unwound the wire and lifted the lid. No one on the team was mentally prepared for what they saw inside. Flashlight beams revealed a woman's white t-shirt, now yellowed with age, folded neatly but coated in dust and mold. Beside the shirt was a long brown hair, dry and brittle. At the bottom of the box was a broken fingernail wedged into one corner, probably from decades ago. And closest to the lid, on the right, was the detail that silenced the entire team. Half of a metal key, identical to the C-58 key, but snapped in two. The detective examined it through his gloves. Edge grooves identical to the key found under the Corolla seat. Surface ground down in the exact same pattern. The engraving still read C5. The 8 had broken off. Put together, the two pieces would form a complete C-58 key. There was no doubt anymore. This item was directly connected to the key found under Emily's car seat. "Seal the entire area," the detective ordered immediately. The FBI taped off all of Row C with yellow tape. No one else was allowed near. Every sound in the warehouse seemed to stop. A small wooden box, hidden behind a false wall for nearly 40 years, had just become the intersection of every event. The key in the car, the dirt under the chassis, the footprints by the lake, all led to one place: Unit C-58 in the old storage row. An FBI agent lifted the t-shirt. Underneath, a long dark stain ran along the collar. Impossible to tell by eye what it was, but it wasn't ordinary age staining. Every tiny item in the box screamed that this unit hadn't just stored old junk, it had once held something or someone tied to Emily's final moments. When the broken fingernail was held to the light, a technician whispered, "Broken nails usually come from grooming, cutting," or he hesitated. The detective finished, or fighting back. No one added anything, but the looks in the room said everything. The snapped half key in the box was the game changer. It proved someone once had two C-58 keys, one master, one spare that broke, and hid the broken half in the box behind the false wall, possibly to prevent tracing. So why did the other half end up under the driver's seat of the Corolla? Accident or carelessness while moving the car? The detective stared at the box, the false wall, the tiny void. This wasn't a temporary setup. This was deliberate concealment, planned, calculated, and given decades to stay hidden. And the most terrifying part, it wasn't created by nature. It was built by human hands. Carrollton Storage, Row C, was no longer just a lid. It had become the center of the case, a piece of land once considered harmless 20 years ago, now revealed as the heart of a secret someone wanted buried forever. And that wooden box, small, old but packed with pieces, was the second key that finally unlocked that secret door. Finding the wooden box, hidden behind a false wall in Unit C-58, pushed the investigation into a whole new layer. But the most critical item in the box, the one with the greatest potential to break the case, wasn't the t-shirt, the broken nail, or even the half key. It was the long brown hair stuck to the fabric edge. In 2024, a single hair could give modern DNA technology a full genetic map of whoever had been in that unit. When the hair and fingernail samples were rushed to the FBI lab, DNA analysis began immediately. Just days later, the preliminary report left the entire team speechless. The DNA did not belong to Emily, and more crucially, it belonged to a man. Degradation analysis showed the hair was extremely old, consistent with being sealed in a dark, airtight space for nearly 4 decades. The extracted DNA was clear enough for both autosomal and Y-DNA testing, 2 critical datasets for tracing paternal relatives. This was something 1986 science could never have achieved, but it was the ultimate advantage in modern cold cases. When the profile was uploaded to genealogical analysis systems, the algorithm began matching it against public databases and authorized law enforcement records. Dozens, then hundreds of partial matches appeared, but only one small cluster pointed somewhere useful. The sample carried a Y haplogroup tied to the male line of the Dillard family, an old Denton County, Texas lineage. For the first time in 20 years, the Emily case finally had what it never had before: a specific surname, a family range, and a real chance to work backward through every male branch of that lineage to find the closest match. Genealogists continued building the Dillard family tree using census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, old address records, and especially data on Dillard males living in the Denton, Carrollton, Lewisville triangle in the mid-1980s. They mapped every branch, every generation, every adult man who could have been in the area near Carrollton Storage. When the family tree was complete, only 3 men matched both the DNA data and the approximate age of the hair sample, one living in Sanger, one who moved to Oklahoma in 1983, and one who had lived just 1.7 miles from Carrollton Storage at the exact time Emily disappeared. His name Franklin Frank Dillard. The lead detective sat silent for a long moment reading the file. Frank Dillard, a name that had never appeared on the original suspect list, never mentioned by any witness, and with no known direct connection to Emily. That was exactly why he had never been considered in the initial investigation. But digging into old address records painted a clearer picture. Frank Dillard, lived in a mobile home park east of Carrollton from 1984 to 1989, only minutes by car from Row C at Carrollton Storage. When the 1993 flood hit, he had moved away before the facility changed ownership. The deeper they dug, the more red flags appeared. Frank had rented a unit at Carrollton Storage in the 1980s. That rental record was among the files destroyed in the flood. No original left. He had basic locksmith experience, former part-time electrician, and crucially, Frank's height and weight matched the large footprint found near the Lewisville lake shore. But what caught the FBI's attention most was the perfect alignment between the broken key half in the wooden box and the C58 key found under the Corolla seat. If Frank had rented or used Unit C58, having both a master and a spare key made total sense. One broke. He hid the broken half in the box behind the false wall. The intact one fell under the seat while he drove the car to the lake. When the full FBI DNA report came back, the conclusion was written in the clearest possible terms. DNA recovered from evidence is consistent with the male Dillard lineage. Autosomal DNA matching strongly suggests the hair belongs to Franklin Dillard, or a very close male relative. At that point, the detective had no doubt left. The C58 wooden box wasn't just storage, it had been a hiding place for remnants, leftovers of an event someone wanted completely erased from the world, and that someone, through the scraps of DNA he left behind, had accidentally left his family name Dillard. In the internal report, the detective wrote, "For years, the Emily Hargrove case had no suspect strong enough to pursue. DNA has now moved the investigation into a new chapter. Frank Dillard is the first individual in 38 years with physical, geographic, and genetic ties to the crime scene." With this evidence, the cold case was no longer a forgotten file. It had just entered its most dangerous phase, because if the DNA pointing to Frank Dillard was correct, then the man who last touched the C58 key, who parked the Corolla at the lake, and who had been inside Unit C, wasn't just connected to Emily's disappearance. He might be the very last person who knew where Emily was in the final hours of her life. The investigation was moving fast thanks to DNA genealogy, but the next breakthrough didn't come from a lab or a crime scene. It came from the last place anyone expected, the old records room at Lewisville PD. While the cold case team was pulling every file related to Emily, a new archival technician discovered a thin 4-page document mistakenly stapled inside a completely unrelated 1987 case folder. The pages were yellowed, the staple rusted, and written in faint blue ink across the top. Witness report. Lake Park, June 1986. When the lead detective opened the report folder, he instantly realized this was the piece the case had been missing for nearly 4 decades. The report documented a statement from a park employee working the evening shift at Lewisville Lake Park on the exact night Emily disappeared. For some reason, that report had never been filed in Emily's case. It had been mistakenly stapled into a completely unrelated suspicious behavior incident from a year later, so the 1986 team never seriously considered it. The contents made the room turn cold. The witness said he had seen a man standing next to a silver Corolla, matching Emily's car perfectly, sometime between dusk and full dark. What made the detective gasp silently was how terrifyingly close the witness's description matched Frank Dillard's appearance in 1986. Based on surviving DMV photos and records, tall build, mitre heavy set mitre shoulders, slightly stooped posture, dark baseball cap, mitre slight work jacket, typical of a tradesman, large feet, slow but deliberate walk. The witness clearly noted he saw no one else in the car, no woman getting out, and especially remembered the man standing right by the driver's door as if waiting or doing something specific. That behavior didn't fit someone just stopping to enjoy the view. It fit someone staging a scene or waiting for the right moment to leave unnoticed. The detective read the description once, then read it again, feeling as if he were looking through the 1986 witness's eyes and seeing Frank Dillard standing right there. It couldn't be coincidence, not when the DNA from the wooden box already pointed straight to the Dillard line, not when Frank lived minutes from Carrollton Storage, not when the Corolla had been cleverly moved from the storage facility to the lake. One report misfiled, just a tiny clerical error or oversight, had been buried in the archives for 38 years, and that single mistake had kept the Emily case from moving forward in 1986. In the original statement, the park employee added one critical detail that had been completely ignored at the time. The guy kept looking around the whole time, not like he was waiting for someone, like he was afraid of being caught. In 1986, that line was treated as ordinary suspicious behavior, not enough to expand the investigation, but in 2024, when added to everything they now knew about the Corolla's appearance at the lake, it became a perfect fit. Large footprint, matched the man described, and the stride length, Carrollton dirt under the car proved the car came from an area where Frank Dillard lived nearby. Key 58 key under the seat matched the broken half in the C58 wooden box. Frank's electrical background knew how to grind and alter keys. Frank's 1986 appearance matched the witness description exactly. The detective couldn't hide the anger mixed with frustration when he reached the final part of the report. Witness returned the next day to add to his statement, but was told the file already had everything it needed, yet that file had ended up in the wrong folder. If this report hadn't been misfiled in 1986, the case might never have gone cold for nearly 40 years. The detective wrote in his own report, the 1986 statement, though forgotten, is the only eyewitness description of the subject standing beside Emily's car the night she vanished. When combined with DNA and AI modeling, the description matches Franklin Dillard in a way that is astonishing. And from that moment, the Emily case shifted from cold case with no suspect to case with the strongest subject it has ever had. Even though that man had stayed off the radar for decades, the door to 1986, thought to be locked forever, suddenly swung open because of one lost report, and behind that door, the name Frank Dillard appeared for the first time, and very likely would never disappear from the case file again. Once Frank Dillard's name emerged clearly in the file, the cold case team knew it was time to dig deep into his entire history, movements, routines, and life. At the time Emily disappeared, the lead detective ordered every scrap of data possible: work logs, mobile home park entries, exit records, payroll from the electrical company where he had been a helper, and any surviving documents from 1986. A behavioral picture began to form, and it was far more suspicious than the team had imagined. Frank Dillard, according to records, was not a social person. He lived alone in a mobile home park east of Carrollton. As a part-time electrician, Frank took flexible shifts, moving between small jobs. The work wasn't steady but paid the bills. Most neighbors described him as quiet, stayed home a lot, sometimes hard to read, but nothing before had ever put him on police radar. Until the 1986 data, the year Emily vanished, was analyzed. The team discovered the first red flag: Dillard was unaccounted for, with no explanation, for 3 consecutive nights immediately following Emily's disappearance from the night she vanished through the next 2 nights. The odd part, at that time he had a regular job with clear time clock records, yet for those 3 nights, Frank never showed up at work, and no one saw him anywhere. No accident report, no illness, no leave request, no message to the boss. He simply vanished. When investigators pulled utility records for his mobile home, the suspicion grew. Electricity usage at Frank's place during those 3 nights was almost zero. No TV, no lights, no significant power draw, meaning he wasn't home. And that window perfectly overlapped with Emily's disappearance, the Corolla being taken to Carrollton, and then parked at Lewisville Lake. Those 3 missing nights, small on their own, became a critical piece for someone as reclusive and punctual as Frank had been the previous month. Suddenly disappearing pointed to a major disruption. The detective wrote in his report, "Normal people can be away from home, but a suspect with a storage unit key, DNA in the unit, and a matching witness description, missing for 3 straight nights right after the disappearance, is one of the most significant factors." But the truly chilling part came when the team examined Frank's behavior in 2024-2025, the period when the cold case was reopened. Using gym membership scans, traffic cameras, bank transaction geolocation, and especially security cameras around the Denton-Carrollton area. They uncovered what the detective could only describe as a behavioral loop. Frank, now nearing 70, still drove routes eerily similar to the path Emily's Corolla had taken in 1986. Not weekly, but regularly, every few months, as if he were unconsciously, or deliberately, repeating an old route burned into his mind. The route had 3 stops, 1 Carrollton Storage, 2 a vacant lot to the north, 3 the road leading back toward Lewisville Lake. 2024 traffic cameras caught Frank's old sedan, driving slowly around the storage facility in the evening. He never stopped, just circled and left. But investigators noted he lingered longer than normal at one fixed point, near row C, as if searching for something. This became even more suspicious when cross-referenced with other data. Cameras on the vacant lot showed Frank parking for a few minutes near dusk. Neighbors said he went somewhere a few times a month, but never took anything with him. Another camera captured Frank scanning the trees near the trailhead to Lewisville Lake. The detective asked in his report, "Why does an elderly man regularly return to the exact area tied to a 38-year-old disappearance? What keeps pulling him back to Carrollton Storage and the lake vicinity?" When they overlaid the times of Frank's recent drives with his past, a loop emerged. 3 missing nights in 1986. The 3 locations involve the same route repeated in the present. This led the behavioral analysis unit to 2 hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, Frank returns because he is haunted, he once hid something, and fears it will be found. Hypothesis 2, Frank is certain evidence still exists at Carrollton Storage, and is checking whether anyone has discovered it. When the team reviewed 2024-2025 footage of Frank, one familiar mannerism stood out. Constantly looking over his shoulder, controlled walking, eyes always scanning as if afraid someone is watching. This is the behavior of someone carrying the weight of the past, or still concealing an old crime. The detective wrote, "Frank's actions cannot be considered random. An innocent person has no reason to return to a location tied to a 38-year-old disappearance, following the exact forensic route. This is late-stage evidence cleaning, or old scene checking behavior." To reinforce this, they re-examined Frank's 1986 work habits, usually early shifts, finished before sunset, often free in the evenings, took side jobs around Carrollton. That perfectly matched the open time windows the night Emily vanished, and when they checked payroll records after the 3 missing nights, they found Frank returned to work tense and quieter than usual, according to one surviving coworker. The coworker had assumed family trouble, but no one, not even colleagues, knew that at that exact time, a 19-year-old girl had vanished without a trace, and her car had been placed in a way only someone intimately familiar with the Carrollton area could manage. The detective concluded in the behavioral analysis, in every case where an offender stages a multi-day cover-up, they typically disappear from work, they need time to process the scene, move the car, erase traces, and stage a false scene. Frank Dillard's 3 nights were not random days off. They were the window needed to create the perfect deception. When the 3 missing nights of 1986 were combined with the 3 repeated routes of 2024-2025, the suspect's profile was no longer vague. It became the behavioral portrait of a man who committed a crime and never escaped his own past. The DNA evidence, abnormal behavior, and Dillard's repeated presence around Carrollton Storage for decades had made him the central suspect. But the detective knew that to go further, to get warrants for a home search, surveillance or deeper intervention, they needed visual proof, something that created an undeniable link between Frank Dillard and Emily's Corolla the night she disappeared. And that proof existed in a place no one thought still held value, a grainy old VHS tape, considered useless, recorded by the park's primitive security camera in 1986. That tape, according to notes, had been reviewed by the original team, but dismissed because the quality was so poor. Heavy noise, blown-out lights, extremely low resolution, that it was labeled, "no evidentiary value, image too blurry for identification." But in 2024, AI image restoration technology could recover 80–90% of noisy footage, separate shadows, analyze motion, and even identify blurred objects through pattern matching. When the VHS copy was fed into the system, no one on the team knew what they were about to see. Restoration began by digitizing and realigning every single frame. 1980s VHS ran at 812 frames per second, with no stabilization, so every frame was streaked, skewed, and overexposed. The AI had to resequence the frames and rebuild motion. After 12 hours of processing, the 7-minute clip finally became watchable, not HD, but clear enough to reveal details the human eye, in 1986, never had a chance to see. The scene showed part of the Lewisville Lake Park parking lot under dim yellow streetlights, everything covered in a hazy glow. Emily's silver Corolla sat far from the camera, but its outline was recognizable. Next to it, a figure stood on the left side, right by the driver's door. The video froze on a critical frame. The AI zoomed in on the area around the figure's left arm. A metallic glint flashed. The AI boosted contrast, then enhanced detail in the metallic region, then rebuilt edges. In the analysis room, the entire team went dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning. A clear image slowly emerged. The man standing beside the Corolla was wearing a large metal watch, stainless steel band, classic square face, the exact style electricians favored in the 1980s. The detective pushed the zoom to the maximum the restored image could handle. The watch face caught the streetlight, creating the distinctive reflection only old metal watches produce. No color was needed. The band shape alone identified the model. A technician pulled Frank Dillard's old file. Inside was a 1985 DMV photo, Frank leaning against his old pickup, left arm hanging down, wrist clearly showing the familiar sight, a large metal watch, identical to the one in the restored video. The detective didn't need to speak. The entire team could see the match was chillingly obvious, and it didn't stop there. When the AI analyzed the man's arm movement in the video, it detected a slightly bent wrist and slower motion, characteristics that matched Frank's old work records. A part-time electrician, who often lifted heavy loads and had mild wrist joint inflammation. This was a detail the human eye couldn't catch in 1986, but machines could now. The video kept rolling. The man in the VHS bent down and placed his hand on the driver's door handle. The camera angle only captured shadow, but the AI brightened it and revealed a thick arm, broad shoulders, heavy build, perfectly matching Frank's DMV description and employment photos from that year. As the man walked away from the car, the AI built a 3D body ratio model based on his height relative to the Corolla. Result 5'11" inches to 6'1", exactly Franklin Dillard's height in 1986. The detective sat frozen. It was no longer just DNA, no longer just geography, no longer just strange behavior. Now he was watching Frank Dillard, or someone indistinguishable from him, standing at the exact spot where Emily's Corolla had been staged, on the exact night she vanished. But the most terrifying part was still coming. The AI ran advanced motion analysis on the man's hand action as he leaned toward the car. Based on wrist angle and flip direction, the conclusion was clear. He was closing a door, not opening it, meaning Emily was not in the car when the camera recorded this. The Corolla was being placed into position, not open to let a victim in or out. That is the behavior of someone staging a scene. When the tape was rewound from the beginning, another detail emerged as the AI brightened the right background. A second vehicle, only a shadow, no visible plate, parked a few meters from the Corolla, mostly out of camera range. But its silhouette showed a small 1980s pickup, the kind commonly driven by tradesmen. Frank Dillard had owned one exactly like it. When the video ended, the room was frozen silent. The lead detective tapped the table lightly with his fingers, then said what everyone was thinking: "We have his picture." Not perfect, not crystal clear, but enough to prove Frank Dillard was in the park the night Emily disappeared. He was standing next to her Corolla. He was wearing the distinctive watch he'd worn most of his life. He left in a way that showed careful preparation. This was the piece no one in 1986 could see. In 2024, it became the first and strongest visual evidence tying Frank Dillard directly to the crime scene. A metal watch catching the faint glow of a streetlight on a moldy old VHS tape had finally spoken what he had hidden for nearly 40 years. It said Frank Dillard was there, and he was no innocent passerby. Once the AI-restored 1986 VHS showed a man wearing a large metal watch standing beside Emily's Corolla, the team knew they were closer than ever to the real perpetrator. But to fully tie Dillard to both the scene and Carrollton's storage, they needed one unique detail, something that could only belong to him, impossible to explain by coincidence or mistake. The key grinding technique. In this case, two keys were central. 1. The broken half of a C58 key found in the wooden box behind the false wall. 2. The intact but deliberately ground down C58 key found under the Corolla's driver's seat. Both belonged to the long-discontinued C-Series lock system from the 1970s, and both showed signs of manual grinding, not natural wear, but intentional human alteration. When the lab examined the keys under a high-magnification electron microscope, they found critical details. Edges showed horizontal scratch patterns, not natural wear. Natural wear, the 58 marking had been ground with a hard tool, leaving faint but deep grooves, suggesting hand tools rather than a machine. Grinding angle slightly skewed left, consistent with a left-handed person. Frank Dillard, per work records and neighbor statements, was left-handed and had been a part-time electrician. When the detective read the first analysis, a chill ran down his spine. The coincidences were piling too high. Not just DNA, not just appearance, not just the video, even the grinding technique matched. The lab went further with cut pattern analysis, a method that identifies tool marks on metal. Results showed grinding marks consistent with small metal files commonly used by electricians for lock adjustments, panel work or screw slot cleaning. Shallow, uniform depth, suggesting a low-hardness hand tool, not industrial equipment. Steady pressure, with no breaks. Highly experienced user. 1. 2 mm edge drift signature of a flat hand file. What had Frank Dillard done for a living? Part-time electrician. The file type electricians used matched the marks on the C58 keys almost perfectly. The lead detective, listening to the lab presentation, only nodded slowly. No one in the room needed to say more. Everything was locking into place. Dillard worked on jobs near Carrollton, storage. He used metal files daily. Both C58 keys were ground using electrician technique. One key broke possibly from overgrinding or intentional snapping, and was hidden in the box behind the false wall. The better ground key ended up under the Corolla driver seat. Pulling old records, the detective found a note from one of Frank's former job site foremen. Dillard always carried his own electrician's file, liked to tweak tools himself. Pretty handy. That single line was enough. If anyone in the Carrollton area had the skill and tools to grind a key to erase its markings, it was Frank. But the bigger question immediately arose. Why grind the keys at all? Behavioral analysis offered 3 reasons. 1. Erase lock traceability. Removing batch numbers prevents police from tracing the key back to a specific unit. 2. Remove fingerprint slile. Residue. Some old-school offenders grind keys to destroy latent prints or skin oils from prior use. 3. Hide the existence of a spare. If Dillard had duplicated the key, one master, one spare, he wanted the spare untraceable. When the detective compared the grinding on both keys, the intact one under the seat and the broken one in the box, the similarity was so strong, it was nearly certain the same person did it. High's same left to right direction, same depth, same left-hand skew, same tool type. This was no longer theory, it was a craftsman's fingerprint. One FBI agent, looking at the final report, blurted out, "Someone who works metal this cleanly has done manual labor for years. This isn't something a regular person can pull off this smoothly. This is a trade." And that trade, exactly as the record showed, was Frank Dillard's. Most importantly, the locations where the 2 keys were found. One inside Unit C58, behind a false wall, a unit Dillard likely rented. One inside Emily's car, where Dillard appeared on video. Put those locations together, and the case structure suddenly became crystal clear. Dillard had access to the unit, 1 in unit tied to C58 key 1, broken key hidden in the unit 1, intact key in the victim's car, 1 in or car driven to the lake by Dillard VHS proves, in U false wall hiding box, professional concealment, 1 in U key grinding technique matching Dillard's trade. The case was no longer a tangle of events, it had become a deliberate chain of actions, from person to location, to evidence, all in the hands of someone with the skill and motive to carry it out. Franklin Frank Dillard, the grinding analysis, once just a minor detail, became the key piece that matched his occupation, habits, and tools. And that is why, in 2024, the detective wrote the closing line in his report. The two keys are not just evidence, they are his signature. After DNA, the C58 keys, and the AI-restored VHS all pointed to Franklin Frank Dillard. Lewisville PD and the FBI knew it was time to shift from paper investigation to live surveillance. If Dillard was truly tied to Emily's disappearance, his behavior 40 years later might accidentally reveal what he had once hidden. And as predicted, 2024-2025 behavioral data showed an extremely unusual pattern. Dillard frequently visited a vacant lot in Denton, not far from Carrollton Storage, and about a 12-minute drive from where he used to live. The lot had been an unfinished construction site in the late 1980s, then abandoned and overgrown with tall grass and scattered brick piles. Traffic cameras only caught Dillard's car entering and leaving, never what he did inside. So a covert surveillance team was formed. They took turns tailing Dillard's old brown sedan, recording every move, without letting him know he was being watched. In the very first week, they saw the first thing that made the detective's hair stand on end. Dillard visited the vacant lot 4 times, always around dusk when light was low and traffic thin. The way he got out of the car was strange, not like someone out for a walk or seeking quiet. Each time he walked straight to the same spot, about 60 meters off the road, between 2 old crisscrossing trees. The surveillance team began using binoculars. They saw Dillard never carried a bag or large items, but he always brought one thing, a long metal tool that looked like a pry bar or crude digging implement. And what they witnessed on the second tail made the report flagged red. Dillard bent down, jammed the tool into the ground, and dug. Actually dug. Not a few pokes to test the soil, not cleaning trash. He dug like someone trying to retrieve something that had been buried, and buried deep. When the detective watched the hidden camera footage, he saw Dillard dig slowly, precisely, like a man who knew exactly where he was looking, not randomly. He would pause, look around, dig again. Soil came up in careful small layers. Thermal monitoring showed his heart rate rising slightly each time he visited the lot, signs of stress, excitement, or obsession. On the 6th surveillance shift, they watched him suddenly stop digging, as if he had struck something. He bent down, touched the soil with his hand, scooped a few more handfuls, and then froze. An officer watching through binoculars described it. It was like he realized whatever he was looking for wasn't there anymore. Then Dillard stood up abruptly, looked all around, wiped sweat from his forehead, and hurried away. The detective could not ignore this behavior. An innocent person does not dig in the same spot 6-7 times in a few weeks, in a place close to both the C58 unit and where he once lived, especially not after his DNA was just found in a wooden box hidden behind a false wall. The FBI put the vacant lot under 24-hour surveillance. They installed thermal cameras, tree camouflaged units, and used small night vision drones. And on day 18, the last day before they were set to request a search warrant, they saw the most important thing since surveillance began. Dillard dug deeper than ever before. For the first time, he went down nearly 60 centimeters. For some reason he seemed terrified of being seen, constantly scanning the area, then slamming the pry bar into the ground, like he was trying to break through an old layer. Later behavioral analysis of the video concluded, Dillard was not looking for something new, he was looking for something old, something he himself had once buried, or buried to destroy evidence. The detective knew exactly what was going through his mind. Is what I hid 40 years ago still here? And the bigger question, has someone already found it before me? Checking an old burial site is classic behavior of someone who once concealed evidence or remains from a serious crime. It is the recurring habit of offenders, terrified the past will be dug up. In the final report for Day 18, the detective wrote, "Dillard is not just returning to Carrollton storage out of obsession, he is repeating the 1986 pattern, moving between the unit and the vacant lot, where he may have buried evidence." The vacant lot was no longer meaningless ground. It became the third piece, after Unit C-58 and Lewisville Lake, 3 pieces forming a perfect triangle of a crime hidden for nearly 40 years. With Dillard repeatedly digging as if searching for old evidence, the only question left was no longer is something down there. It was, what did he bury, and how is it connected to Emily? The detective looked at the Carrollton, Denton, Lewisville triangle map, and knew it was time to open the ground, and open Franklin Dillard's past. After 18 days of covert surveillance, and watching Franklin Frank Dillard repeatedly return to the Denton vacant lot, as if checking a secret buried with time, the task force understood one thing was still missing: a direct DNA sample from Dillard himself to confirm the suspect 100%. Genealogical DNA had narrowed it down to the Dillard line, and the hair and fingernail from the C-58 wooden box pointed to a man, very likely Frank, but everything was still at high probability. They needed irrefutable proof, a straight line from the evidence to the living person, and the opportunity came on Day 20 of surveillance. At a small gas station north of Denton, Dillard stopped for coffee as usual. He stood outside his car, took a few sips, face tense but trying to look normal. When finished, he tossed the paper cup into the trash can next to the pump. An FBI agent watching from a distance immediately marked the time, then waited until Dillard drove off. The team approached the trash can, retrieved the cup with nitrile gloves, and sealed it in an evidence bag. It was a routine move in modern cold case work, where DNA from discarded items becomes the key to breaking the case. The cup was rushed to the FBI lab at Quantico. Within 48 hours, the preliminary report was ready. DNA recovered from the cup rim belonged to a white male matching Franklin Dillard's age group. But the most important part was not in that report yet. Everything waited on the direct comparison between DNA from Dillard's coffee cup and DNA on the T-shirt found in the C-58 unit box, evidence that had lain silent for nearly 40 years. The task force gathered in the lab as the technician ran the final comparison. The computer screen showed 2 long strings of genetic markers. The software began aligning them, segment by segment. With every match, a soft ping sounded. Ping, ping. Each sound was a piece of truth sharpening. Then the technician took a deep breath and turned the screen so everyone could see. The words appeared. Match confirmed, 100% identity, autosomal plus Y chromosome plus microsatellite agreement. The room went silent for several seconds. No more suspicion, no more lineage probability, no more possibility. This was absolute identification. The DNA on the T-shirt in the box, hidden behind the storage unit wall, where Emily was believed to have been taken, belonged to Franklin Frank Dillard himself. The lead detective spoke slowly, each word carrying the weight of 38 frozen years. "We've got him," an FBI agent added, "and he can't explain why his DNA is in a box hidden behind a false wall. That's not a place an innocent person ever steps foot in." From that moment, Emily's disappearance was no longer a scattered trail across time. Everything connected: the ground-down C-58 keys, Dillard's trade, the broken key half in the box, the spare mats, the intact key under the Corolla seat, the master, Carrollton, dirt under the car, where he lived, the 1986 witness description, matching his appearance, the restored VHS video, his metal watch, 18 days of surveillance, digging behavior at the vacant lot, and finally, direct DNA from a 2024 coffee cup, matching 100% with 1986 evidence. This was the final piece needed for a Texas standard arrest warrant, probable cause supported by physical evidence. The detective signed the request, his hand trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from realizing that what Emily's family had waited nearly 40 years for was finally here. The day of reckoning, and with one more judge's signature, Franklin Dillard, the man who had lived like a ghost in Carrollton, would not escape his past for another single night. The arrest warrant was signed by the Denton County judge early Monday morning. Less than an hour later, the FBI tactical team and Lewisville police quietly approached the small house where Frank Dillard had lived for the past decade. The house looked worn, paint peeling, rusted iron fence, just like the quiet, solitary life of the man they were about to cuff. But behind that calm exterior, law enforcement knew Dillard had carried a crushing secret for nearly 4 decades. As the team approached, no sirens, no flashing lights, just soft footsteps and the click of safeties coming off. An agent knocked firmly. "Franklin Dillard, this is the FBI. Open the door." No answer. The commander signaled. The rotting wooden door was rammed open with a breaching tool. The scene inside: Dillard was sitting at a small kitchen table, hands flat on the surface, eyes startled but not panicked. As if he had known this day would come, he just hadn't known it would come this fast. 2 officers moved in. One read the charges clearly. "You are under arrest by order of the Denton County Court for kidnapping, tampering with and destruction of evidence related to the 1986 disappearance of Emily Hargrove." Frank looked straight at them, eyes dark and empty. "I don't know who that girl is," he said, voice eerily calm. Police didn't respond. Cold handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. At headquarters, Dillard kept the same attitude. He claimed he had never met Emily, had never been to Carrollton storage at that time, and had nothing to do with any wooden box or keys. He denied everything, from the digging to appearing in the 1986 video. But forensics is not storytelling. It is math, genes, data, something no denial can erase. The detective laid out each piece of evidence, not as interrogation, but like stacking bricks until the wall of truth was too high to climb. Evidence: 1 DNA from the t-shirt in the C58 box. 100% match with DNA from the coffee cup he threw away in 2024. Cannot be explained by family match or contamination. Dillard went quiet, eyes blinking slightly. Evidence 2, broken key half in the box, and key under the Corolla seat. Same type, same manual grinding marks, same direction, same left-handed electrician signature. Dillard lowered his head, hands tensing. Evidence 3, 1986. VHS video, AI restored. When the agent played the clip, the image of the man with the large metal watch glinting beside the Corolla made Dillard turn his face away. "That's not me," he said, voice trembling just a little. Evidence 4, movement patterns. Repeating the Carrollton-Denton-Lewisville Lake route, continuous digging in the exact area suspected of holding buried evidence. Dillard said nothing more. At the end of the interview, the detective closed the file and said only one sentence: "You came back too many times, left too many traces, and science is not on your side." First court appearance: the arraignment drew local reporters, not because the case was fresh, but because it had been ice cold for almost 40 years, and was suddenly resurrected by modern technology. When Dillard was brought into the courtroom, he looked smaller than in the old footage, but his eyes still carried thick defiance. Denton County Prosecutor Marlene Proctor read the charges. Kidnapping, sufficient evidence Emily did not leave Carrollton voluntarily, tampering with evidence, the hidden box behind the wall, and moving the car to the lake. Unlawful restraint, based on indirect traces and behavioral analysis. Prosecutors held off on more serious charges due to no body, but they knew these 3 alone were enough to keep Dillard locked up. Defense counsel objected, claiming the DNA could be contaminated over time. The prosecutor gave a small laugh, then presented the combined autosomal plus Y chromosome plus microsatellite results. "Your Honor," she said, "the error rate in this match is not 1 in a million, it is 0. Dillard sat motionless, fists clenched, but never looked up. In the final submission to the court, the prosecution wrote, "Franklin Dillard did not merely leave DNA keys and traces at the scene. He left a behavioral pattern spanning 4 decades, and every time he returned to Carrollton, or the vacant lot, he unwittingly reenacted his own 1986 crime." The full trial was scheduled, and for the first time in nearly 40 years, the name Emily Hargrove was spoken in a Texas courtroom, not as a forgotten girl, but as the victim in a case cracked by technology, persistence, and a truth that could not stay buried. Frank Dillard's arrest shook both Lewisville and Carrollton, not just because he was suspected in the Emily disappearance, one of the area's longest cold cases, but because of how the case was revived, through AI technology, modern forensic DNA, and the relentless pursuit of investigators. News spread across North Texas within hours. People talked about the C-58 wooden box, the ground-down keys, the blurry VHS that became critical visual evidence. Most of all, they talked about how a man who had lived among them for decades could hide such darkness. But the biggest aftershock was not the public reaction. It was inside the Lewisville PD investigation room, where two other long-dead cold cases were suddenly dragged back into the light. Just 2 days after Dillard's arrest, a veteran lieutenant reopened the list of unsolved disappearances from 1980, 1987. She noticed 2 cases from 1984 and 1985 that shared chilling similarities. The first case, 1984, a 21-year-old woman named Marjorie Ellis vanished after her shift at a small sewing shop in the colony, about a 10-minute drive from Carrollton Storage. Marjorie's car was found roughly 7 miles from her workplace, in a quiet park by the lake. Doors locked, no signs of a struggle, no body, no witnesses. Police at the time ruled she had left voluntarily, but her family always believed something had happened to her. The second case, 1985, a 19-year-old part-time sales clerk named Tessa McGraw disappeared while driving home from her evening shift at a clothing store in Carrollton. Her Civic was discovered in an odd location, an empty parking lot near the road to Grapevine Lake. The driver's seat was pushed way back exactly like Emily's case. No signs of assault, no forced entry, and no body was ever found. Back then, the 2 cases were considered unrelated, but in 2024, when forensic technicians reviewed the files, they spotted matches that sent chills down their. Both victims were young women, both worked evening shifts, both drove alone, both cars were found near a lake area, no evidence of a struggle, no bodies, and most importantly, both vehicles were within a 3-6-mile radius of Carrollton Storage. Everything pointed to the same center, the exact area where Dillard had lived, worked, and rented a storage unit. When Lewisville PD contacted the FBI about the possibility of reopening those 2 files, the forensic agents were blunt. If Dillard really is tied to the 1986 Emily case, the odds are extremely high this wasn't a one-time act. Behavioral analysis showed it was highly plausible. 3 consecutive years, 1984, 1985, 1986, 3 young women disappeared with nearly identical patterns. 1 vanished after an evening shift. 2. Car moved. 3. Scene left overly clean. 4. Victim never found. 5. Drop point near Carrollton Storage, or the nearby vacant lot. Even the staging, neatly parked, doors locked, driver's seat adjusted, was so similar, it could be a behavioral signature. Lewisville PD immediately held a press conference, announcing they were reopening the 1984 and 1985 disappearances. They didn't name Dillard as the prime suspect, but they said striking coincidences required re-examining all DNA, photos, witness statements, and physical evidence, with modern technology. The lead detective told the cameras, "We can't confirm it yet, but we also can't rule out the possibility that Emily's case was not the only one." The room went dead silent. As for Emily herself, even though the 1986 cold case had been solved legally and forensically, one painful truth remained. Emily had still not been found. No burial site, no body, no final resting place. Investigators believed the vacant lot Dillard kept digging in might once have held part of the evidence, or worse. But nothing concrete had been located yet. The search continued. Thermal drones, ground-penetrating radar, and geological scanners were all deployed. Emily's family, after nearly 40 years, finally had the biggest answer: who was responsible? But they still lacked the final one: where is Emily? While Dillard's trial awaited its date, Lewisville PD did not close the file, they expanded it. The Emily case was no longer an ending. It became the starting point for two other cold cases. The 1986 cold case may have been cracked, but the ultimate truth still lay somewhere between Carrollton, Denton, and Lewisville Lake, and the investigators knew, to bring Emily home, they had to keep walking the path that the ground-down C-58 key had opened, a door leading deep into the darkness, where secrets buried for nearly 4 decades were still waiting to be uncovered. The story of Emily Hargrove's 1986 disappearance in Lewisville is not just a tale of a case solved through technology and persistence. It also reflects a deeper reality in American life today. Personal safety is more fragile than we think, and the smallest, seemingly meaningless details can save an entire investigation. From the ground-down C-58 key, the wooden box hidden behind a false wall, to Franklin Dillard's repeated returns to the vacant lot, every detail in this case shows that evil rarely shows its full face, but it always leaves traces that technology and human perseverance can unearth. For Americans today, the biggest lesson is never ignore your gut. If a person, a place, or a situation feels wrong, act, tell someone, call the police. Emily's family reported her missing the very next morning, and that decision kept the file alive, so that 38 years later, it could be solved with AI, DNA, and unrelenting effort. Beyond that, the story highlights the power of technology in protecting communities. Blurry old VHS tapes, dirt under a car chassis, or dusty records once thought worthless, now become keys, thanks to LiDAR, genetic analysis, and restoration tech. It is a reminder to American society in the digital age: preserve, protect, and value data, because one day it might save a life. And finally, the case reminds us that justice in America may come late, but it does not disappear as long as someone keeps searching for the truth. Emily has not been found yet, but the truth about who took her has been brought to light. That is the victory of persistence, community, and a hope that never dies. If you want to keep following cold cases cracked by modern technology like the Emily Hargrove story, hit subscribe so you don't miss any journey back to the truth. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue uncovering mysteries everyone thought time had buried forever.